Take action by March 2nd, 2022. Learn more by following us on Twitter at STC Action Fund. Thank you so much.
An EIS is just a decision-making tool. Government got really bad at doing stuff like dumping sludge into riverways and building nuclear, camps and poisoning people. So under the environmental laws in the 70s, we started requiring everybody to, when they're making a decision, go through a decision-making process. It's the same thing as you do when you're deciding where to go to dinner. You have 4 alternatives: don't eat the food in the fridge, order Thai, or go to pizza. And then you have 4 criteria on how you're going to decide between those. Don't eat kind of sucks for satisfaction, but it's really cheap. Going to pizza, you're going to have pizza on Tuesday. That doesn't work. And when you put those 2 things together, you get a table. And that table is essentially what an EIS is. The draft EIS coming out for the industrial lands is 700 pages. It's a little more involved than deciding on where to go to eat, but it's kind of the same thing. We have 4 alternatives: no action, limited industry, targeted industry, expanded industry. And we're analyzing them based on how they do on jobs, how they do on water resources, how they do on land resources, and how they do on transportation. The process is actually really straightforward. We started out several months ago making a scoping. That scoping set those top bars and the sidebars. Now we are at the draft EIS. That's where the consultants and the city have put together an initial consideration of how these work out. Is alternative 1 really good on jobs? Is alternative 4 really good on jobs? Yes. That's the draft EIS we're looking at. It's 700 pages. Don't read all of it. The next step is going to be taking the comments we give right now by within the term, which is changing right now, but we'll get to that. Those comments get fed back into the city. They have to respond, and some stuff will change. The final EIS will look different than this one. And that final EIS is going to be used to propose legislation. But this gives you an idea on how to actually read this environmental impact statement, this draft environmental impact statement. Do it selectively. The summary, 60 pages, it's pretty straightforward. The proposal and alternatives are a couple pages. They outline a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about tonight. And then there is this 500-page mass in the middle of it about environment impacts and mitigation. But you know what that actually breaks down into? 14 sections. If you're not interested in utilities, don't read the utilities section. If you are interested in housing, read the housing section. Or just read the summary and see if you like it. So don't be afraid of this massive, massive document. It's actually pretty straightforward once you understand it's 4 alternatives tested against some criteria. Now, I will back up 1 second, starting with new zones proposed for the industrial areas. These are not the alternatives. I'll get to that in a minute. These new zones are awesome, and they are forward-looking for the city to protect a lot of industrial uses that we're dealing with. There's a new zone called mixed maritime and logistics. That's the basic industrial zone where factories and maritime and other stuff can be located. No new residential stuff to dilute how much industrial we have, and a strict maximum size on non-industrial uses. This prevents Whole Foods from locating in Inner Bay in the future. There's a second new zone called Industry and Innovation. That's a little bit more technical, allowing stuff to go on top of industry, like offices and research labs. This is the industrial stuff that can be located near light rail stations in the future. Very good ideas, and it actually reflects good pedestrian and cyclist movement and good construction standards for industrial space. The third new zone is Rod Sterling, and he is a dimension not only of sight, of sound, but of mind. The actual third new zone is urban industrial, and that's a maximum size on use limits for standalone non-industrial. Again, this is preventing mini storage from taking over industrial lands. This is where makers and production people can be on the ground floor, and some interesting mix of uses with expanded housing for caretakers and maker studios and stuff like that. These are the three new industrial zones. They are excellent. Now, to the alternatives in the environmental impact statement. The alternatives are the mix of these three new zones. Alternative number one is no action. Don't take any action. The city will still have all the exact same industrial uses as it does now. They can be switched over to mini storage. They can be switched over to Total Wine and More. They can be used up as stadium accessory bars and the Duwamish. This is not a good option, but it is required by law to be one of the alternatives. The first real alternative of the new zones is the Future of Industry Limited. Most of the industrial areas, and Laura mentioned manufacturing industrial centers. There's two of them, Inner Bay and the Duwamish. Those are the two industrial centers in Seattle, Inner Bay to the north and left of the screen, Duwamish in the center. Most of those under alternative two get turned into manufacturing and logistics, maritime manufacturing logistics. That's where factories go. 6% becomes the innovation. A lot of that is along the Elliott Bay, and 6% becomes urban industrial. That's along Dravis and right near the stadiums. Caretakers housing, no areas are removed. The second alternative expands the industrial innovation to within a half mile of future transit. That's around Expedia, and that's around the John Stanford Center. Also, the urban industrial becomes all of Brewery Row in Inner Bay or in Ballard. Additionally, a chunk of Georgetown gets removed from the industrial areas. That's this little red square at the north end of Georgetown, and a little square way south in South Park, right along the waterway. That's been done at the request of some of the neighborhoods, so some other folks may have more information about that. Option 4 is the Future of Industry Expanded. The industrial innovation becomes even bigger, but Inner Bay isn't there. It's mostly around the stadiums. Urban industrial takes over Brewery Row and expands down around, well, where the basketball stadium could have been, but thankfully was not. Again, more parts of Georgetown, or the same nodes in Georgetown and South Park, are removed under this option. Those are the 4 alternatives. Those are the 4 things along the top of the row of the chart that get tested against all of these assessments of noise and pollution and traffic. This DEIS is very good, but we can go far in making it better. As Laura said, the first thing we're asking for is to broaden the history. Industrial areas in Seattle are a story of exclusion. This is the redlining map from the 1930s. All of the colors on there are: blue is good housing, yellow is moderate housing, and red is bad housing. Unfortunately, that coordinated a lot with neighborhoods of color. That also directed where most of the industrial land in this city goes. And we have continued that through every zoning rewrite for 100 years. The DIS does not tell that story, and it needs to. That's also the unfortunate part of cutting the maps off at Market Street. because without seeing that there is no industrial zones north of Market Street, we can't tell the story of how industrial has been pressurized into neighborhoods of color and very small part of the city. The second thing we're asking is an analysis of the lot depth and sizes available in the zones. I'm putting up here a picture of Greenwood, the intersection of Greenwood Avenue, and what is it, 85th is in orange. And what you see is the commercial zone in that neighborhood. Unfortunately, commercial zones outside of the industrial areas are only one lot wide, not blocks, lots. That has become a problem because businesses can't fit in many of these zones anymore. So when you have something like Yonder Bar, the Yonder Cider folks who are only at the other end of the block that has Wingdome on it or across from Wingdome, they could be a commercial zone and have gotten in fine, but their block is only allowed to have commercial at one end. Our zoning throughout the entire city has only been zoned to allow very small slivers of commercial. And that has forced a ton of commercial uses like Holes, like Total Wine and More, like Fred Meyer's, to go into industrial zones and take land from employers that could be manufacturing, that could be supporting fisheries, that could be supporting many of the other things that bring businesses and good paying jobs. Failing to allow manufacturing and industrial outside of industrial zones puts an enormous amount of pressure on legacy industry and maritime uses. There was a very good author that I got to talk to recently. She put it in terms of hot sauce, handbags, and hardware. That every neighborhood gets better when you can have places that you watch them make the stuff they're about to sell you. We don't allow that in the city except for industrial uses, except for industrial zones. We can do a lot better. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now in order to talk specifically about the transportation component and many of the things that are going on in that category. But I just want to reiterate what Laura said, that we have a choice of whether we're supporting big box and dangerous transportation or we're supporting job creating industrial and maritime. You know, you are an expert in the neighborhood that you have. You know the neighborhood you want. You get to send in comments. And I hope this has made it a little easier to understand how what you're commenting on. So thank you. I will turn off screen sharing now.
Yeah, so next up, I'm going to highlight and spotlight Ryan, and they are someone who I've known and learned from for many years, and they are just a wonderful person to go see a play with. That's not in Ryan's bio, but if you ever need someone to go to a play with, Ryan is a great person to go with. And also, to say more about Ryan, Ryan Packer uses they, them pronouns and has been writing for the Urbanist since 2015, writes about the way the layers of Washington's transportation ecosystem work together, particularly on the issue of safety and climate. So things having to do with, if you've ever heard of the phrase Vision Zero and safe streets, and folks that are fighting to make it safer for us to all get around when we're not in our cars. I think a lot of times it gets framed, unfortunately, that it's, you know, there's times in our lives where we're passengers in vehicles, and there's times in our lives when we're walking around in neighborhoods, you know, and when we're walking through an industrial land, sometimes, you know, maybe we got there in their car or not, but at that moment when we're walking around, we're a pedestrian. And you know, I walked to industrial lands yesterday, no sidewalks, you know, almost got hit by a truck, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I am a person that has a car and I drive places, but when I'm walking around in Seattle, there's a certain level of safety around these industrial lands that I don't feel is adequate right now. And so one of the reasons that Share the Cities Action Fund asked Ryan to be here today is to really highlight that aspect. And once again, like I said at the beginning, for those of you that are new to Share the Cities, we started out as a housing advocacy organization, and we focus on all sorts of things: economic justice, broadband, digital equity, transportation. But at the end of the day, what we're really interested in is talking about things that other people aren't talking about and filling in gaps, whether it's our public golf courses or industrial lands. We noticed that none of the other organizations that we kind of like look up to are talking about this issue that much. And so we were looking to kind of fill in that gap and highlight this as an issue. So yeah, and the other organization that talks about this a lot is the Urbanist, and Ray and Ryan both write for the Urbanist. So I am going to add your spotlight. And yeah, thank you for being here, Ryan.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah.
Thanks for that great introduction. I don't have as much of a fancy presentation as Ray does, but that's a really great intro to the EIS alternative process. Every EIS is required to analyze transportation. Going from a light rail line down to a new apartment building is required to have that sort of look at what the transportation impacts are going to be from any alternatives. But I want to talk a little bit about how that's measured. So in Ray's example of ordering the pizza, one of those metrics is satisfaction, and another, that sort of what is actually being measured. And a primary metric that is in the CIS for the maritime industrial lands is overall travel time. So people who are going through Inner Bay, people who are going through Georgetown and South Park, what is their travel time in a car going to be? And the question is that the primary metric that we want to gauge the impact on? Because we know that when we add population, people are going to do what's easiest for them to do, which is if the roads are wide open and they can get around easily in a car, they're going to do that. But if it takes a little bit longer, they might consider alternatives or look at what they have available to them. But the reason that travel time is really important in a maritime area is obviously because of freight. And that's people driving their trucks to get the things that are actually made and processed and completed in the industrial zones, because they can't be completed anywhere else in our city or really in our region. But when we're sort of lumping that in with overall travel time, people living in Magnolia, people living in Highland Park, it gets a little bit muddled. Fascinating tidbit that's buried into this transportation addendum to the EIS is the fact that 2% of vehicles in Inner Bay are freight vehicles, and 5% of vehicles in SODO are freight vehicles. In other words, 98% of vehicles in Inner Bay are not moving goods. And so when we try and measure overall travel time, and we're measuring 98% of the traffic that it could be people going to and from their industrial jobs, but it's not the primary reason we want to keep vehicles moving, because we know that the more we try and do that, the more people will want to drive. The principle of induced demand, in terms of if it's easier to drive, people will do that. So, but interestingly enough, in Ballard, and we've all seen the growth in Ballard in the past 20 years. The study for the Ballard Bridge replacement, which is deeply tied into all of this work with industrial land future, the study for the Ballard Bridge replacement showed that vehicle volumes at 15th Avenue Northwest and Northwest Market Street, so basically the busiest street in Ballard, were exactly the same as they were in 1998 that they were in 2019 with all the added people. And so the question is, is this document projecting an increase when we haven't really seen traffic go up over those 20 years? And who are we trying to move again? Going back to that, the city of Seattle is currently working on a project to integrate all of its modal plans. So we have a bike plan that doesn't talk to a pedestrian plan, that doesn't talk to a freight plan. They're trying to integrate all of those plans right now. And one of the proposals is that in manufacturing and industrial centers, freight traffic gets priority. And so that could come in the form of a freight lane. It could come in the form of a freight lane that's also a bus lane, but it's separate from expanded vehicle capacity. And so the question is, to what extent is that studied in this EIS? And the answer is not very much. It's not treated as a major policy tool in terms of being able to move vehicle traffic that is freight separate from general purpose vehicles. When we look at the study for the Magnolia Bridge related to the Ballard Bridge study, that study assumed a dramatic increase in traffic on 15th Avenue, which if it came to pass would be pretty detrimental to freight if it didn't have its own lane. But that study needs to be taken with a grain of salt for all I've mentioned. But what that leads to is decisions about the future of the Ballard Bridge and the Magnolia Bridge, essentially creating its own self-fulfilling prophecy. If traffic's going to go up 30% on 15th Avenue by 2035, then we better plan for a big Ballard Bridge, and then we do that, and then we get it. And so, but a little bit, zooming out just a little bit more. So what are we measuring? We're measuring general purpose travel time, and we're measuring bike and pedestrian access. So those are already not on the same level. The question is, how fast can you access something in your car, or whether you can access it even at all on a bike or walking. But unfortunately, the bike and pedestrian projects in the EIS are really only framed in terms of, is it there right now, or is the city planning for it? Not, can people on bikes access everywhere they want to go? For example, 15th Avenue West in Inner Bay has a Whole Foods, has Staples. Can you ride your bike there? All the bike facilities that are planned to go through Inner Bay are on the Elliott Bay Trail, which is behind all of the businesses. So if you need to actually access those businesses to do your errands, how are you measuring whether you're able to even do that or not? And so the city can talk all it wants about the great messaging around shifting people away from vehicle trip to a non-vehicle trip. But if you're not actually able to do it and quantify how many people are able to do that, you're sure you can walk to something. You can walk to Whole Foods on 15th Avenue West, but have you done that? I have, and it sucks. It's not fun. You know why? Because there's 6 lanes. And so like, those are trade-offs that also get quantified. And that sort of gets into my final point in terms of zooming out a little bit. So the federal infrastructure bill that Joe Biden passed in November, signed in November, includes a modest amount of money to look at historical highways that have gone through communities across the country, divided them, destroyed homes, and caused air pollution to this day. Today, Governor Newsom of California actually announced a similar program that would be aimed in California. And that's basically taking a look at the transportation infrastructure we have right now and saying, is this actually net benefit to our community, or is it better to reassess this? That's not present in this EIS. We're talking about SR 99 in South Park is sort of at the forefront. I believe that's the link that Laura just put in the, not quite. I'm gonna put that link to the article that,
yeah, I've just been dropping things on the link, and I can send this to everybody that attended here afterwards in an email. But the things that I've dropped in the chat for folks that may or may not be looking in it, not to take away from everything that Ryan's saying, but I just wanted to drop in the link to look at all the articles that Ryan has written in the Urbanist, a link to an article Ray wrote about, or that Ryan wrote about some of the tensions and the forces at play. There's a lot of like trade-offs here, and there's a lot of competing interests. There's the rail, there's freight, there's cars, there's people and walking and biking. There's economic interests, there's environmental interests. And unfortunately, a lot of times the way that our city makes decisions is they look at the past reports and the past studies, and they make the future studies really heavily weighted in the past. And Ray and I saw this in the BERT report, so I dropped that in there. That's related to the future funding for Ballard and Magnolia Bridge. And the state of Washington commissioned, you know, a $750,000 consulting report that basically left out, you know, the climate emergency, and left out all the rhetoric around Vision Zero and safe streets and creating places for pedestrians to feel comfortable and safe. Like, didn't really make it into that report, because the report was looking at kind of the way that we built our city in the 80s and the 90s, and it baked in a lot of those assumptions. And so that's kind of like the main work that Ray and I have done is around the BERT report, and which is the Ballard Interbay Regional Transportation Study that was commissioned by Gail Tarleton. And so the BERT report is a mechanism by which the state can then go to the federal government and ask for money for the Ballard and the Magnolia bridges. So the reason the BERT report existed was kind of like almost like a box they had to check to be able to hold out their hands and say, give me that money for the bridges. We need, you know, $1.5 billion for the 2 bridges. Give us the money. They're crumbling. And so they did the report. And what Ray and I say is, while you're doing this report that's a check mark, a $750,000 check mark, hey, there's some things we want to see in there, and we're not seeing them. And so this DEIS from the city is much more forward looking. It's so much better than the BERT report. It's talking about economic and racial injustice. It's talking about future, how what the past happened, we don't need to repeat those same mistakes in the future. And so compared to the BERT report, reading when I finally got a chance to dig in, you know, it's 700 pages. So I spent a lot of time on my weekend doing that, and did not charge Share the City's Action Fund for that time. I was just like, I'm just going to read this thing. But like it really is a future facing document. And it's a really good step, and really hopeful that our city is not just trying to, is actually trying to look forward, to look at industrial and manufacturing lands, how they can be greener, how we can have multi-level buildings, how we can have green buildings near transit, how we can have incentives for transit-oriented manufacturing, which is not something I'd ever even thought of about doing you know, we're putting these light rails in. And if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have said like, wow, it's kind of a waste that it's industrial, right? Like I kind of like didn't understand industrial lands. And now I'm like, wow, this is such a great opportunity for people to be able to get to and from their industrial jobs without having to drive, if they're right embedded in them. And so I definitely have had like a lot of awakenings around the importance of our industrial lands. I am, out of the 3 of us, I can't say this for sure, I think I'm the most like preservationist around them. Like I really think it's a slippery slope. One thing I really want to emphasize before, I know some people probably have to leave at 8. We're going to go till 8:30. But if you have to leave at 8, if you take nothing else away from you, Share the Cities is not anti-freight. Share the Cities is not anti-economic development. We absolutely want our industrial lands and our businesses to grow. We want them to thrive. We want industrial lands to not have to compete on the open market with residential and commercial lands. If we rezone this land to other uses, capitalist forces around the world will zoom in and, you know, turn it into an office park, or turn it into another big box store, or turn it into public storage, or whatever, you know, is the best use under capitalism. And all the little businesses, I did a Twitter thread yesterday of all the little businesses that are just in this one building across the way, over by where the new light rail stations go in, where the new store and practice facility is going to be. There's this one building, there's like Dusty Strings makes their guitars over there. And there's all these cool artists over there. And there's people doing steel stuff. And there's a building across the way that has, I think, 200 employees, and they have like 8 businesses in it. And they have like some like automatic pizza thing happening. And like, I mean, it's almost like it's just like, it's almost really cool to just walk around and like think about like a beehive of activity that's happening over there just in those two buildings. That's really exciting to me. And I have just such an appreciation for the people that are over in Magnolia, all the upholstery businesses for cars. And like, I don't know, there's just a lot of like misunderstanding when Share the Cities and the Urbanist are writing and tweeting and kind of complaining about how our industrial lands aren't pedestrian friendly. We're not trying to get rid of them. We're not trying to say that they don't belong in our city. We're not trying to push them out of the bounds of our city. We want actually more industrial uses. We want more yonder ciders. We want, you know, one of the things Ray and I talked about, and we haven't discussed this with the residents of Magnolia Park, and we obviously wouldn't be advocating for this without their blessing, but, you know, there's a lot of residential and office compatible industrial uses that could be like really cool, like maker spaces or other things at Magnuson Park. Like, why can't Magnuson Park have some industrial uses in it? It already does. And, you know, maybe Ray can talk about that more. But when we start thinking about of industrial uses and we have a forward-looking idea of what that is instead of, 100 years ago, and we think about non-polluting industrial uses, we have to think about noise mitigation, obviously. We obviously don't want people living next door to something that's really loud and noisy, but we want to make sure our trucks can get around, and we want to make sure that people and trucks are not mixing in a way that is dangerous and deadly. And so I used to drive for Metro for a year and a half. I was a bus driver. I drove the 212, I drove the 74 and the 76. And as a bus driver driving a big bendy bus around the city, I can tell you that I have a great appreciation for the challenges of driving a big vehicle in Seattle and what roads are compatible with that. I had to drive a bus through Wedgwood where every day I just held my breath because on either side there were cars, smushing me in. So if there are any freight folks on this call, and I'm sure there might be, I just want you to know that I personally understand how hard it is to move about the city. And we just want everyone to have a safer, more predictable. Right now, there's a lot of dangerous unpredictability built into the systems. And again, I want to do another workshop with the folks in Georgetown and South Park, and maybe from Duwamish Community Coalition as well. And really focus on that part of town. Obviously, Ray and I have a bias on Ballard and Inner Bay, which we're very transparent about. We're not trying to pretend that we're not, focused on where we live. That's what happens when you live in a neighborhood, is you get like kind of zeroed in on it. So Ryan, did you want to add anything?
I just wanted to note, I was kind of finishing up my thought about, so there's a great group of people who are looking at, can we actually remove SR 99 through South Park, which it's a relatively low volume freight route that could free up 40 acres in South Park for equitable development. Obviously, we'd want to look at what the impact of doing that to particularly Georgetown and drivers heading across the South Park Bridge over to I-5 as an alternative would be. But I have to note, again, going back to the EIS, that according to their metrics, the freight activity in the Duwamish MIC found that 50 to 70% of medium and heavy duty trucks in Duwamish Valley are passing through, and 75 to 80% of the trips in South Park, which has 99 in addition to 509, which is being extended down to the Port of Tacoma, are pass-through trips. And so we're not actually talking about impacting freight that is required to access that MIC. And so we're both trying to separate out, okay, is this general purpose traffic or freight? And is the freight actually trying to get through, or is there another way that we can think about having to go through South Park, which is obviously it's an urban village, it's a residential neighborhood, and like Ray mentioned, is being protected in this EIS process.
We are right now, Share the Cities Action Fund is a 501c4, and we're mobilizing at the state legislature. I've been awake since 7 and working since 7 on a lot of state legislature stuff. And one of the things I want to talk about at the state legislature for folks to take action on, and maybe Ray can find the link and drop it in there for me, is Liz Berry has a public development authority for Interbay that she put forward last year. And Liz Berry is the state representative from the 36th legislative district, a fantastic person. So lucky to have her as my elected. And the Interbay PDA, we've done a lot of acronyms tonight. MIC, which is the Manufacturer Industrial, I forgot what the C stands for, and then the DEIS is another acronym. And now I'm throwing another one at you, and I apologize, everyone. I hate acronyms. So PDA is a public development authority, and Liz Berry wants to enact that. That came out of work. I'm going to drop the link for the work. That was the Washington Commerce is looking at the National Guard site. So the National Guard is planning to move in the next 10 years, and that's the land between where like the Whole Foods is in Interbay and BNSF Railway. And that land in between, if you go there and you kind of stare in there, you'll see like army looking equipment and people in fatigues and all that stuff. So that's the National Guard post. That building is falling apart. They need a new building. They need more space. And so if you want to get real deep into that, you can dive into that page that I just dropped in there from commerce.wa.gov. But there's a bill. What's the bill number, Ray? You don't know. Okay. I'll find it. Okay. And then Ryan, are there any bills that you want folks to advocate for connected to transportation advocacy or freeways, or are there things in the transportation budget that folks should be kind of watching for right now?
I don't have a specific industrial one. I will plug SB 5687, which would expand the authorization for cities to install speed cameras around schools. Since I know that particularly, in South Park with Concord Elementary, having to tools to calm arterial traffic with the industrial freight traffic is obviously because when you have freight lanes, you typically have a wide lane that can be used for speeding by smaller vehicles. So that would expand the authority, not the actual cameras themselves, but the authority to be more flexible about where we install automatic speed cameras.
I got a ticket going down Stoneway, a speeding camera ticket going down Stoneway. I was going 22 miles an hour in a 20-mile-an-hour zone, and I got a ticket. And I have never not, and that was 10 years ago, and I have never not gone 19 miles an hour ever since. So that's my own personal traffic cameras worked on me, right? On going down Stoneway, because I definitely used to go too fast down that. Okay, so there's a lot of Georgetown folks here. Your side of town has not been represented tonight, and we have more time. And we definitely want to hear from you. So please let's talk, and we can host you if you want, or you can host yourselves and we can promote it, because we want to hear what your priorities are for that part of town so that we can include that in our advocacy and have your voices heard in that. And if you're here from a freight group and you're learning for the first time that Share the Cities Action Fund actually doesn't hate people that like drive trucks for a living and like get us the goods that we need and support small businesses, and we actually want to work with you, we would love to have a meeting with you. Ray, what would you like to add to this conversation? First of all, thank you, Ryan, so much. I'm going to give you a little party emoji. I really appreciate what you had to say. I'm going to remove your spotlight. Ray, would you like to say anything?
I think Ryan hit a whole ton of stuff right on the head about the transportation issues in the industrial areas. And just to reiterate, 2% of traffic is freight. When we're talking about going over the Ballard Bridge, 2% is 60 odd trucks northbound in an hour compared to the 5,000 cars surrounding them at peak times. Most of those trucks that go across the Ballard Bridge are small trucks. We don't have a ton of large trucks, and we're just not sizing the bridge correctly in order to accommodate that very small number of freight. We're overemphasizing how much cars need to speed by and adding more cars to that bridge just because people can't get across it any other way. I know that there's a lot of times that we've driven in order to get to Ballard Market or just into Inner Bay because it's treacherous and there's no other way to do it. The other thing I think you brought up, Laura, that was very important was kind of makers and industrial uses outside of industrial zones. And I think there's an important thing to mention that a lot of the things that show up in our industrial zones are kind of incidental industrial. They are there because they needed a really big floor plate or low rent. A whole lot of commercial bakeries are a good example. Climbing gyms that we're big fans of myself. We have these things in industrial lands because there aren't other places to put them. The zones are too small outside, like I showed you on the map. They're not permitted in a lot of parts of the city. These incidental industrial uses really drive up the cost of rent for legacy maritime uses that support the fisheries, the canneries, things that we want to keep good paying jobs in the industrial areas. And it's really cool to watch people make stuff near your house. In Ballard, we do have a ton of breweries. Maybe not the best thing to have right underneath your house. I wouldn't mind, but we do have, it is fun to go and see them make beer. It is fun to see people make chocolate. It is fun to see people make handbags. And to have those in our neighborhoods are really amenities that we don't explore. We stuff them into industrial zones because they make stuff. Once there is a machine introduced into some of these makers, they have to go into the industrial zone. They're not allowed in commercial or mixed use areas. So we can even say candy makers. It'd be nice to have a taffy puller nearby. I also want to say that one last thing, Fred Meyer in Ballard, the one right on Leary, that used to be a steel plant, and now it's a grocery store. Many of the zones that we created were created at a time when that was still a steel plant. And so this wave of changing the zones to maritime manufacturing logistics, industrial innovation, and urban industrial is way overdue. It reflects the way that our city works, rather than the image of industry as a giant smokestack. And hopefully it's something that we can support.
Thank you to Ryan Packer from the Urbanist, Ray Dubicki from the Urbanist and Share the City's Industrial Lands Working Group. To learn more, email info@sharethecities.org.